Have you ever stopped to consider, um, what if the way we define mental illness,
Yeah.
what if it isn't really about objective truth?
Yeah, like some fixed scientific fact.
Exactly. But maybe something, I don't know, deeper, a kind of historical fracture in how we think.
That's a powerful way to put it, and that's precisely what we're diving into today.
Okay, so we're looking at insights from Dr. Jaime Hoerricks' work.
That's right. Specifically her piece, Neutrality Was Never Neutral. Objectivity as Settler Logic, Psychiatry as Empire's Epistemic Machine.
Ooh, heavy title. So our mission today is to unpack this argument.
Yeah, the argument that objectivity itself, especially in psychiatry, like with the DSM, isn't neutral, that it's maybe what the source calls a technology of empire.
A technology of empire, okay.
Yeah.
And what that means for how we see suffering and healing.
Exactly. It's a really fundamental challenge to how we think about these things.
All right, let's unpack this then. Get ready for some truly mind-bending insights.
It's fascinating. The source doesn't start with Freud or even the first asylum. It goes way back.
Further back.
Much further. It talks about this fracture so embedded into the structure of Western knowledge that we barely notice it.
Okay, like a foundational split.
Right. Deep in Western thought.
And where does the source trace that split back to?
It points pretty directly to René Descartes, 17th century.
Cogito ergo sum.
Exactly. I think, therefore I am. And the source argues that this declaration, it had a massive impact.
How so?
Well, Hoerricks argues Descartes essentially severed thinking from embodiment.
Split the mind from the body.
Right. Established this idea of the sovereign mind as private and immaterial, totally separate from the mechanized world of flesh and matter.
Okay, that is a radical idea.
It really was. And from that separation, the argument goes, came this whole fantasy of detached observation.
Neutral measurement. Objectivity as the ultimate goal.
Supreme virtue, yeah. That you could stand apart and just observe without influencing or being part of it.
Wow. And the source connects that philosophical idea directly to, well, some pretty heavy real-world stuff.
It does. It calls that Cartesian dream the scaffolding of colonial expansion, of capitalist extraction, of eugenic science, of psychiatric classification.
So the core idea is to extract something or dominate something or even pathologize it, you first have to kind of dislocate yourself. Pretend you're detached.
Exactly. Strip it of its history, its context.
Like the source says, turning suffering into symptoms floating free of context.
Yeah. Like looking at a checklist without knowing the story.
Okay, so this abstract idea of objectivity, it didn't stay abstract for long then.
Not according to the source, no. It argues it became a very practical tool, a tool of empire.
How did that work?
Well, think about the colonial project. All over the world, right? The source says they used instruments like the map, the ledger, the census, the catalog as well as weapons.
Weapons.
Take the example of the Gael in the Scottish Highlands. Their relationship with the land wasn't about ownership, it was a web of kinship. Deep connection.
Right.
Then came the maps, the parcels. That rich relationship got reduced to property. Something to be measured, owned, exploited.
Turning relations into property.
Wow. And it wasn't just land. This applied to knowledge itself.
How so? Epistemic gatekeeping. Is that the term?
Exactly. Deciding whose knowledge counts. The source argues that ways of knowing held by, say, indigenous communities, queer folks, disabled people, neurodivergent people.
People whose knowledge comes from lived experience. Embodied knowledge.
Right. That kind of knowledge was often dismissed, called anecdote.
Not real data.
Precisely. And affective knowing, knowing through feelings, intuition that got labeled irrational, and having a relational orientation, seeing yourself as part of a community, part of the land, that was framed as primitive.
So basically, if we can't measure it our way, it doesn't count.
That's the core of it, yeah.
Yeah.
Objectivity used to invalidate other realities.
And the source gives some really stark examples of this in practice.
It does. Things like, to measure indigenous children by foreign IQ tests.
Tests completely outside their cultural context.
Right. Or to classify colonized bodies into racial taxonomies, codifying difference as defect.
Turning suffering into medical disorders, histories of harm into just symptom lists.
Exactly. And tools like the census, the eugenic registry, the diagnostic manual, the source says they were all designed to produce knowledge about people.
But never with them. Always from that detached outside perspective.
So taking that bigger picture, the argument is that this whole machinery, once aimed outward at colonies, eventually turned inward.
How so?
Psychiatry, the source argues, emerged as a kind of domestic empire, an internal bureaucracy of the mind.
Okay. Explain that a bit more.
Well, early on, madness might have been seen as a moral issue, maybe spiritual.
Right.
But with the rise of science, the goal shifted towards classification, trying to be objective. The source says symptoms were extracted from stories, cataloged, systematized.
Trying to pin down the messiness of human distress.
Exactly. Replace complexity with neat categories.
Which leads us straight to the DSM, doesn't it? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
It does. The source calls the DSM, Psychiatry's sacred text, one of the purest descendants of this lineage.
Because it codifies human distress into lists of observable traits.
Yeah, and critically, abstracted from power, from poverty, from dislocation, from historical violence.
So it takes the suffering, lists the symptoms, but ignores the why, the context.
That's the argument. It positions the clinician as the neutral observer and the client as this kind of malfunctioning object to be classified.
Like a broken machine?
Kind of. And as the source puts it quite starkly, the problem is not that people suffer. The problem is that the system refuses to see why.
Okay, this is really challenging stuff, especially if you've ever engaged with the mental health system or received a diagnosis.
It is.
The source claims every diagnosis is already entangled. A collapse of meaning, not a discovery of it. What does that mean? A collapse of meaning.
It suggests that the act of diagnosing isn't just identifying something already there. It's more like imposing a framework that simplifies, even flattens, the person's experience. The observer is never outside the system.
So what gets called a disorder? The source says it's often the embodied residue of unmet needs, of unsafe environments, of stolen autonomy.
Right. Think about it. Depression, anxiety, autistic distress. The claim here is bold. These aren't primarily diseases of the brain awaiting chemical correction. They're seen as relational wounds carried by bodies forced to survive inside disordered systems, responses to the world around them.
Responses, not just malfunctions.
That's the perspective, yeah. And this really gets into power dynamics.
How so?
The source argues that neutrality in diagnosis is basically, well, it's the lie. It's impossible.
Because every diagnosis does something.
Exactly. It's a power move. It creates eligibility for services. That's power. It creates vulnerability to surveillance, also power. Dependency on pharmaceutical intervention, institutional containment.
So the act of labeling itself changes things, creates realities.
Yeah, it takes that relational suffering distress arising from our connection or lack of connection with the world and frames it as individual pathology, a problem located solely inside the person.
Okay, so if this whole idea of detached objectivity is flawed, and it shaped how we even think about mental health, where does the source go next? I heard something about quantum mechanics.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating parallel. The source looks at 20th century physics and how it fundamentally blew up that idea of the neutral observer. Quantum mechanics showed that the very act of observation collapses probability into outcome.
Meaning the observer changes the thing being observed.
Precisely. The observer is no longer outside the system, but inside the becoming of what is measured. You can't separate them. The knower and the known are entangled.
Like trying to measure a tiny thing without affecting it, it's impossible at that quantum level.
Exactly. At the deepest levels, it seems reality is relational. Everything affects everything else, which kind of shatters that old Cartesian dream of detached knowing.
Wow. And how does this apply back to diagnosis?
Well, the source argues diagnosis isn't just passive observation either. It's a participatory intervention.
Meaning the act of diagnosing does something.
Yes.
Yeah.
When you apply that label, identity shifts. The social meaning of a person's distress changes. How they see themselves, how others see them, it all changes.
So the clinician isn't just finding a disorder. They're helping to construct its social existence.
Yeah.
They're participating in shaping that reality.
Okay, that's profound.
Yeah.
So if diagnosis itself is part of constructing the reality of disorder, what does that actually mean?
It's a huge question, right? What if the diagnostic act is part of the problem? The source gives examples.
Yeah.
Like the hungry child diagnosed with inattentive disorder or the anxious adult diagnosed with generalized anxiety. The source says these aren't discoveries in a neutral sense.
They're lapses. Yeah. Collapses the freezing of relational suffering into individual pathology. It stops the exploration of the wider context.
The focus stays on the individual's brain or behavior.
When the real problem, this perspective argues, lies not in the brain, but in the world the brain inhabits.
The environment, the system, the relationships.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's bring this down to earth. For someone listening, navigating their own struggles or trying to help someone, what does this look like? The source talks about medicalization of structural harm.
Yes, this is where it gets very concrete. It paints some vivid pictures.
Like,
Okay, imagine someone with a trembling body, weary mind. Maybe they're dealing with precarious housing, unpaid labor, insecure wages, constant stress.
right.
The system might label that depression, but the source asks, isn't it really grief, exhaustion, affective response to sustained precarity, a normal, though painful, human response?
A response to the situation, not just a brain chemical issue.
That's the argument. Or take someone with a tight chest, racing thoughts. Maybe they're deeply affected by rising tides of climate collapse, tightening grip of empire, these huge systemic anxieties.
Which many people feel.
Right. The system might say generalized anxiety disorder, but the source suggests maybe it's vigilance, a correct reading of instability, the world is dangerous, the body knows.
So the anxiety is appropriate information.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
A signal about the state of the world, not just a personal malfunction.
And what about kids?
Well, picture a child who is just overwhelmed by sensory intrusion in a standard classroom, maybe lashing out or shutting down. They might get diagnosed with behavioral disorder, oppositional defiance, autism spectrum, but the source reframes it as possibly protest. It is protection. It is refusal to comply with environments built for others.
The environment is the problem, not just the child's reaction.
That's the lens here.
Right.
And it leads to these direct claims.
Which ones?
Things like income inequality becomes ADHD. Housing instability becomes generalized anxiety disorder. Food insecurity becomes mood dysregulation.
Wow.
Generational trauma becomes complex PTSD. Systemic marginalization becomes personality disorder. It's essentially saying societal failures are being diagnosed as individual sicknesses.
And the consequence of that is huge.
It is, because, as the source argues, pharmaceutical interventions are offered where structural interventions are denied.
Meaning we get pills instead of solutions to the root cause.
That's a critique, like a new antidepressant instead of universal housing, or cognitive behavioral therapy instead of guaranteed food security.
So the treatment becomes a stand-in for actual social change.
The substitute for justice is how the source puts it, and it brings us back to that core question.
Now, whether people suffer.
But why must they suffer in the first place? Where is the suffering actually coming from?
Okay, that's a heavy critique of the current system. But does the source offer any alternative, a different way forward?
It does. It's not just tearing down. It's pointing towards what it calls another way, a relational alternative.
Relational.
Yeah.
Based on connection.
Yeah. It highlights things like the power threat, meaning framework, the PTMF, as a contrast to the DSM.
How does that differ?
Well, simplistically, where the DSM might ask, what is wrong with you? Or what disorder do you have? A relational model like PTMF asks different questions, like what happened to you?
Centering the story, the experience.
Exactly. And what meanings have you made of those experiences? What strengths carried you here? It shifts the focus completely.
From deficit to experience and resilience.
Right. And this ties into what the source calls the core tenets of relational knowing.
Which are?
Ideas like the mind belongs to the body belongs to the community belongs to the land. Reconnecting those things, Descartes supposedly split apart.
Mind, body, community, environment, all interwoven.
Yes. And the argument is that when basic needs are actually met, when bodies are housed, fed, held, included, a lot of what we label mental illness might just dissolve.
Not necessarily through a pill or a therapy session.
But through relational repair, healing the context, the connections.
And the source gives actual examples of what this relational care looks like.
Yeah, and they might surprise you. Things like mutual aid is mental health care.
People supporting each other directly.
Right. Basic income is mental health care. Housing security is mental health care. Universal health care is mental health care. Even just relational safety is mental health care.
So the solution isn't just in clinics.
The source says it was always in the field, in our social structures, our communities, how we relate to each other, and the planet.
Wow. Okay, so this connects back to that idea of epistemic refusal, refusing the detached way of knowing.
Precisely. It's crucial to understand the source isn't saying science is bad or rejecting knowledge itself.
It's more nuanced than that.
Much more. It's a call to recognize that science is never outside its own entanglements, its own history, its own power dynamics.
And it draws on other fields to back this up.
Yes. We already talked about quantum physics showing the observer isn't neutral.
Right.
Ecology shows systems thrive in balance and connection, not top-down control. Disability justice highlights how bodies carry vital knowledge that detached experts often miss. Neurodivergent experiences show that sensory, emotional, relational ways of knowing are real, valid, often deeply wise.
And indigenous knowledge.
Indigenous traditions, the source notes, have always known this interconnectedness, that the world is alive and we belong to it, not apart from it.
So this refusal isn't just about rejecting something.
No, it's about restoration. The source calls it the restoration of plural epistemologies. Making space, again, for all the ways of knowing that got sidelined or dismissed.
Making space for what was dismembered?
Exactly. Embodied knowing, sensory knowing, relational knowing, story as knowledge, land as teacher, community as medicine. It's about wholeness, reconnecting those fractured pieces.
What a journey, seriously. From Descartes' split
That initial fracture.
to objectivity as a tool,
Yeah.
a technology of empire, its role in psychiatry and the DSM.
Then seeing that objectivity kind of crumble under scrutiny, even from physics.
Right. And then landing on this call for a relational, decolonial way forward towards healing that's rooted in connection and context.
It's a profound rethinking.
It really is. It leaves you with a big question, doesn't it? Building on what the source lays out. If our whole way of understanding suffering stems from that deep fracture mind from body, self, and world, then what kind of fundamental shifts do we need, not just in how we treat distress,
but in how we structure everything.
Yeah. How we design our societies, our communities, our relationships.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. So something for all of you listening to think about.
Yeah.
How might these ideas change the way you see mental health yourself and the world around you?